Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Business History Conference book series. My name is Paula de la Cruz Fernandez, and I am the BHC's digital editor. For more on the book series, check out the BHC's website and calendar on the bhc.org. This interview is being live streamed on YouTube, and I am monitoring there in case there's any questions. You can chat with me there. The video and the audio will then be available on our YouTube channel after the interview is over. Today is October 10th, 2025, and we have the pleasure to host Albert Churella, who is a professor of history at Kennesaw State University with a specialization in transportation history and regulatory policy. His first book, From Steam to Diesel, examined the technology and managerial practices associated with a complete displacement of existing firms in the railway locomotive industry. He's recently completed a 20-year project to write the complete history of the Pennsylvania Railroad at one time the world's largest business corporation. Volume 1, Building an Empire, 1846 to 1917, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2014. Volume 2, The Age of Limits, 1917 to 1933, was published by Indiana University Press in October 2023. And the third and final volume, which we're talking about today, The Long Decline, 1933-1968, also from Indiana University Press, was published in the fall of 2024. Today, we're talking about this book, and Professor Churella is also the president of the Levinson Group, an educational organization that seeks to promote a dialogue on transportation history and practice. He also holds the distinction of being a National Model Railroad Association Master Model Railroader with a basement-sized layout depicting the Sandy River and Rangeley Lakes Railroad in 1919. Hello, Al.
Hello, Paula. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Today, this interview is also hosted by my daughter, but it's also we have two outstanding scholars. Marc Rose is professor of history at Florida Atlantic University, where he publishes in the area of urban, business, and social history. Marc's most recent book is A Good Place to Do Business: The Politics of Downtown Revival since 1945, 2020, and it was published in 2022. Marc is a former president of the Business History Conference, and in 2024, the trustees choose him for their Lifetime Achievement Award. Hello, Marc.
Good morning. Good to see all of you.
And Marc Levinson, who is an independent historian and an economist in Washington, D.C. His books include The Box: How the Shipping Container Made the World Smaller and the World Economy Bigger, and The Great A&P and the Struggle for Small Business in America. So I'm going to start with the first question about how, please, Al, tell us a little bit more about you and about how this project came about, this 20-year project came about, and how you've completed it.
Well, it started in 2003 as what was supposed to be a fairly short one-volume work. And the more I did some research and writing, the more I realized this was such a complex and nuanced story that touched so many aspects of American life in terms of political history, economic history, business history, history of technology, labor history, regulatory policy, the involvement of women, African Americans in the labor force, that to do it justice, I had to expand it to, it was supposed to be two then, and finally three volumes, three very long volumes, So it's a bit kind of unusual, I suppose. These days, most people publish fairly short 200-page monographs, and each volume is about 800 and some pages long. And there's no real theme or thesis here. I wasn't setting out to use the Pennsylvania Railroad or any aspect of its history to reinforce a theory about why certain things happen. I was just trying to tell the story and let people draw their own conclusions from that.
Al, let me ask you a question to help get us going here. There's been a lot written by historians about the Pennsylvania Railroad, and it's been held up as somewhat of a paragon of modern management. This was supposedly one of the first companies to have a strong bureaucratic, centralized management. You paint a really different picture of the Pennsylvania Railroad that was a lot more complicated and perhaps not so scientifically managed as some of the conventional wisdom might have it. Could you talk about that?
Well, that issue goes back well into the 19th century. If you look at someone like Alfred Chandler, who kind of cut his teeth on the railroad industry, and he was particularly interested in the Pennsylvania Railroad because of its size and its organizational complexity. And Chandler, of course, got a lot of things right about that, but he also focused, I think it was really on just one organization manual for the railroad, as if it were a sort of static document. And there's been a lot of research done since, going back to the origins of railroad management. A lot of people have pointed out that really it was the United States military that in many ways pioneered modern managerial techniques because they were dealing with the same things, a large, complex bureaucratic organization, geographic dispersal, lines of authority, the need for kind of instantaneous on-the-ground decision making. And to some degree, at least, the Pennsylvania Railroad and other railroads copied that. But I think what's really interesting, I think what Chandler sort of missed about all of this was the extent to which the managerial structure of the railroad was very fluid and very evolutionary. And the organizational manuals were not something that was imposed from the top down, but rather they were organic documents that were generated by senior management sort of overseeing what people on individual divisions of the railroad were doing, seeing what worked and what didn't, and then bringing those small scale localized innovations into the next iteration of the organization manual and then systematizing them over the entire company. And that process continued. And in particular, in the 20th century, in the period covered by volume 3, there were multiple sort of reorganization efforts, some of which were effective at increasing managerial oversight without disrupting local autonomy, but others were really just kind of frantic efforts to bail out a ship that was already sinking.
Al, can you tell us a little bit about the size of the Pennsylvania Railroad, say, after the Second World War? How many employees were there? The extent of the system?
Well, it was for a time. This is 1881 to 1901, the largest company in the world. So it was a big deal. Now that began to change. Its employment peaked during World War I at about 250,000 people, which is substantial. And that was a public policy decision on the part of the United States Railroad Administration. Employment declined pretty precipitously in the decades that followed. So by the time of World War II, we're talking 50 or so thousand employees, actually far more productively managing more freight train miles and passenger train miles than their predecessors had done. And then after World War II, there's a steady decrease in employment because all the reasons that are familiar to people who study transportation, competition from highway traffic, from later air carriers, um, railroads automating and mechanizing and so on to replace labor with machinery. And that becomes a very serious issue, obviously for American workers and their unions, but also becomes a public policy issue. What do you do with all these people who have devoted their lives and their careers to railroad employment, who are, realistically too young to retire and too old to do anything else? And how who's responsible? Is it the company that's responsible? Is it the federal government that's responsible for ensuring that these people will have some measure of protection as their jobs are being slowly reduced through attrition and the contraction of the railroad industry?
Your third volume, The Long Decline, begins in 1933. Why that date? What caused you to think about this as a cutoff point?
Well, in pragmatic terms, I wanted to have all three volumes of roughly equal length. And in fact, one of the chapters that was supposed to be in the second volume got shifted to the third volume. And I think it works reasonably well there. But the cutoff in 1917 between volume one and volume two makes a lot of sense. American entry into World War One. 1933 is the depths of the Great Depression. And it's not really clear what's next for the railroads. They've experienced substantial declines in local passenger service because of automobiles during the 1920s. They're bearing the effects of truck competition as well. They're trying to push back against that, Pennsylvania Railroad in particular, because it had truck and bus subsidiaries. The trucking industry is not yet regulated by the federal government. That happens in 1935. And this is also about the time when the Pennsylvania Railroad is starting to lose some very important talent. President Atterbury dies in 1935. His successor, his handpicked successor, died a couple of years earlier. Ivy Ledbetter Lee, who's the PRR's sort of go-to public relations person, uh, is essentially discredited because of his involvement with the Nazis. And he dies at a fairly young age. And so the Pennsylvania Railroad lacks his sort of public relations acumen. The politics in Philadelphia are changing. And so the Republican machine in Philadelphia is kind of losing its grip. And that's making it more difficult for the railroad to navigate local politics. And of course, there's the election of FDR in 1932. He takes office in 33. And initially, Atterbury in particular, who's a staunch Republican, is supportive of FDR, and he thinks that things like the NRA can bring some kind of order to a chaotic competitive situation. But it's really in the very early stages of Roosevelt's first administration, when Atterbury is at the very end of his life, that he starts to turn against very vehemently against any kind of government meddling as he sees it in private enterprise. And it kind of marks the beginning of a very confrontational period between government at all levels and railroad management. And that abates in 1935 when Martin Clement becomes president. But he is, quite frankly, not really up to the job and can't deal with a lot of the issues, the Great Depression, what really nobody sees coming at the time, which is the Second World War, and the things that follow. So there are all these changes, and things perhaps could have gone differently had certain people not died, had different managerial decisions been made. But so it's really a time of when of flux, when it's uncertain. And I've structured the books, just the three volumes, as kind of a birth and adolescence in volume one, maturity and stasis in volume two, and then decline in volume three. And there are a lot of references to people who die in volume three as the company itself is really dying.
Al, can we go back for just a moment or two to the scale of operations, not just the number of cars or locomotives, but all of the suppliers for the railroad and all of their employees? So let's say the peak moments are 1945, 46 at the end of the Second World War. Then what took place over the next 10 or 15 years as the railroad dismisses employees, people retire, and then all of the companies that supplied coal, fuel, parts, metal. So the Pennsylvania Railroad was a central portion of the Midwest and Eastern economy. And then finally, in the late 1960s, it ceases to exist.
Yeah, historically the Pennsylvania Railroad was vertically integrated to a substantial degree, built their own locomotives and cars. Of course, the Altoona Works in Western Pennsylvania, and that began to diminish really even before the Second World War, but certainly after the war, dieselization and so on means the Altoona works are a shadow of their former self. Altoona as a town never fully recovers, massive unemployment. It's persists even to this day. And so it's not only the internal production of stuff for its own use, but the things that it buys from outside companies from all over the place. During the age of steam locomotives in the early 20th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the single largest purchaser of bituminous coal in the United States. So, massive influx of coal, not only that it's hauling to factories, power plants, and home heating and everything else, but using itself, and that diminishes, and the coal industry is devastated by all sorts of things that really are not directly related to the railroads. Employment declines. It only affects Altoona, but all sorts of railroad towns across the United States. And that becomes an issue in the 1950s and in the 60s when it's clear that the Pennsylvania Railroad and other railroads in the Northeast are in serious trouble. And it's not merely a question of how do we protect that company, its investors, and its employees, but what's going to happen to the American industrial economy and even to national defense if we lose this important transportation infrastructure, a company that, has 11,000 miles of route, it serves 13 states, it weaves together the industrial heartland of America, and what responsibility does the government have to intervene to protect all of that from the decline of a specific privately owned and managed corporation?
So did anybody think about those questions in a systematic fashion? Any agency, any people?
Everybody thought about it, everybody worried about it. It was a topic of conversation, news media, politics, and everything, but systematically, no. As you know, certainly from the research and writing you've done, we have never had a consistent, coherent national transportation policy. We've had regulatory compartmentalization with each mode of transportation regulated more or less independently. So the Interstate Commerce Commission is the agency, of course, that regulates the railroads, and they have considerable authority, but their mission, which is given to them by Congress, so you can't necessarily blame the ICC entirely for this. The ICC's mission initially is to protect the public from the railroads, from the alleged excesses of rapacious robber baron capitalism and all the other things that came about during the Progressive era. And then it kind of shifts after 1920 to this mandate to protect the railroads from each other, to make sure the stronger railroads don't prey on the weaker ones. And at no point does the ICC seriously, or any government agency, seriously come to grips with the concept of protecting the railroads against other modes of competition, or somehow balancing modal competition in a way that is best for the national economy and most efficient and that kind of thing. And so no, that never happens. And remember, it's post World War II. It's in the context of the Cold War, and so there is a complete anathema regarding any kind of government intervention in private enterprise because it smacks of communism. And so there are those kind of political boundaries to what can be done, particularly in the context that the railroads have dominated American transportation since the 1840s or 50s. And nobody can quite come to grips with the idea that they're in trouble. They seem invincible. And the notion that something so massive and so central to the American economy could also be in serious trouble it was difficult for people to really uh, take that message seriously.
Al, you mention here that the railroads and the public were suspicious of government intervention in the market. You talked earlier about a top executive, a leader of the Pennsylvania Railroad that thought that the government should stay away. And yet your book shows that the Pennsylvania Railroad got a lot of money from the federal government.
Oh, absolutely. And not just the federal government, all government at all levels. The Pennsylvania Railroad, going back to its incorporation in 1846, more than half of its initial capital came from local government, either the various districts of Philadelphia or Allegheny County, Pittsburgh. And that trend continued. Never as extensive a support as, say, the Baltimore and Ohio or a few other companies like that. But there was constant support at all levels of government. It's a developmental model, the notion that the government has a responsibility at some level to promote improved transportation, which rebounds in the form of economic growth, higher standards of living, prosperity, all those other kinds of things. Now that shifts by the late 1800s when the railroads are a mature industry, but there's still certainly a lot of involvement of the railroads in public policy. Certainly, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was created in 1887, is to a large degree supported by the railroads. They favor it as a mechanism for overseeing orderly competition. In other words, it's a government managed cartel. This is what the ICC initially is, in effect. 1906, the Elkins Anti-Rebating Act is written by lawyers from the Pennsylvania Railroad and the Santa Fe, and they simply sort of hand it off to Congress during the administration of PRR President Cassatt, and Congress, with very minor modifications, puts it into law. So there's a lot of ways in which the railroad influences public policy. But in terms of direct support, we traveled today between New York and Washington, Amtrak's Northeast Corridor, under catenary, under electric wires. And most people don't realize that A, the Pennsylvania Railroad put that in the 1920s and 30s, and that B, that was financed to a large degree by the federal government, first through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Hoover administration entity, and then later through the Public Works Administration. So government money went into that. The Acela train sets that operate in the Northeast Corridor today are these sort of distant successors of the Metroliner, which had not overwhelming, but some financial support and oversight from the federal government. So clearly that was there. You look at commuter rail, SEPTA in Philadelphia, and the Long Island Railroad, which used to be a Pennsylvania Railroad subsidiary in Greater New York. There was a long and convoluted process for enlisting first local and then state and federal aid to alleviate the financial losses associated with commuter rail on Pennsylvania Railroad and other carriers. So over and over again, there are ways in which the Pennsylvania Railroad receives money from various levels of government, and particularly after World War II, well, actually particularly after 1920, when the first Red Scare and fears of Bolshevization and so on are in play, the railroad is very careful not to use words like subsidy. They're talking about things like purchase of service and so on, but in effect, that's what's happening is the government is subsidizing the railroad in many different ways.
So I'm getting the sense, Al, of no one central organization in the federal government, or certainly in the railroads, able to achieve some coherent national transportation policy. We subsidize the Pennsylvania Railroad, but also subsidize highways and eventually airlines. What did railroad people and people at the Pennsylvania Railroad say about funds being expended on their competitors?
Well, it was a standard line at the PRR and all the other carriers, and echoed. Of course, by the post-war period, the individual railroads are not doing much in terms of public relations. They're turning all this over to the Association of American Railroads, the industry trade group. But the standard message is that it is monumentally unfair for the federal government to tax the railroads and for state governments to tax the railroads, and then turn around and use that money to build things like the New York Thruway or surface roads or whatever that are depriving the railroads of revenue. And that argument falls on deaf ears because, of course, highway construction has overwhelming political support. And it's a powerful argument, it's a legitimate argument, but in the context of the absence of a national regulatory policy, um, there's no way that argument is going to either preclude highway construction or result in a situation where there's a sort of balanced level of investment in railroads, inland waterways, airports, highways, and all the rest.
One of the aspects of your book that I found most interesting was your discussion of racial integration of the workforce. You paint a picture of the Pennsylvania Railroad's management as being somewhat caught in between, making some effort to hire African Americans and to promote them to jobs throughout the workforce, but running into very strong opposition from the labor unions that represented Pennsylvania Railroad employees. Could you take us through that and explain some of the forces that were in play here?
Well, in both world wars, there were obviously labor shortages because so many railroad employees are going to the military, an increase in traffic demands and so forth. Of course, the railroad faced competition from shipyards, steel mills, all the other employers of industrial America. So in World War One, really for the first time, the Pennsylvania Railroad hires large numbers of women and African Americans. There's a sub story here that I really covered in volume 2, not volume 3, about the role of the United States Railroad Administration in ostensibly, at least superficially, granting equal pay for equal work to women and African Americans, which sounds very progressive. In reality, it's not. It's simply a sort of pragmatic way of preventing African Americans in particular from coming to the North, courtesy of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and then immediately jumping ship and going into other industries where they could get a higher pay. But in World War II, the story is much the same, although there's no United States Railroad Administration. Pennsylvania Railroad hires, in addition to women and African Americans, large numbers of Mexicans. This is modeled on the agricultural bracero program. And management certainly welcomes those employees as an alternative to what they literally called riffraff labor, that is, drunks, drifters, incompetents of one sort or another. They also valued women, African Americans, Hispanics, because they could pay them less money. And they were, in effect, a disposable labor force that could be eliminated once the war was over and demand for labor went down. Having said that, what I've seen in the archival record is that Pennsylvania Railroad managers were actually, very compassionate about all their employees, and they said, look, these people work hard. They've committed to the railroad. We need to, in some sense, commit to them and protect their interests. The real opposition came from organized labor, especially the railroad brotherhoods, the operating employees, the enginemen, firemen, brakemen, conductors, and so on, who belonged to unions that had written into their union charters that membership was for white men only. And they certainly were not willing to accept the presence of African Americans in particular in the workforce, demanded that employment agreements with African Americans and women and Hispanics definitively state that once the war emergency is over, they will be unceremoniously let go. A lot of tensions. Obviously, they were not allowed to join labor unions. And so it was a very difficult balancing act for management. They said, look, for practical reasons, in other words, to keep our employees of color and women, we have to protect them to some degree. And it's also the right thing to do. But on the other hand, the more we do to protect female African American and Hispanic employees, the more we tend to alienate labor unions, which we don't want either. And in the end, it was really the government, not at the federal level, but especially in New York State level, that began to intervene to protect the really relatively small number of African Americans in particular who worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad within the state of New York. And that began to sort of tip the balance that later kind of expanded into federal policy.
So, what kinds of jobs did African Americans, Mexican Americans, women of any background, what did they do for at the company?
Well, as you might expect, they were excluded from the highest skilled, highest paying jobs. So African Americans and Hispanics in particular would have been assigned to maintenance of way work, which is the most difficult, physically demanding, and lowest paying category of labor. And I should point out the Pennsylvania Railroad, by the way, publicized this, right? This is cultural pluralism. This is one of the themes of World War II, that we're all in this together, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, religious background, geographic location, that kind of thing. So they promoted through advertisements, through pictures in newspapers, what they called rather incongruously female trainmen or women trainmen, um, uh, women working in railroad shops. There's a fairly well-known picture of a group of African American women engaged in maintenance of way work, with a little disclaimer at the bottom that said these women are not allowed to lift more than 15 pounds, which is absurd given the physical intensity of that work, but it's designed to reassure the public that women were not somehow being defeminized by their involvement in this traditionally masculine occupation. So African Americans worked in machine shops as helpers. They worked as locomotive wipers, sometimes hostlers, moving locomotives within the railroad yards and so forth. What I find fascinating here is the extent to which at the local level, in places like Wilmington, Delaware, and the shops there, uh, Mexican Americans were put to work at fairly menial jobs, and then something would happen. There would be a locomotive that came in at 3 o'clock in the morning, needed to be fixed right away, or a surplus of work. And the shop foreman would look around at some of these Hispanic workers and say, do any of you know how to rewind a motor? And one would say, yeah, I do. And they would put him to work doing, because they said it's easier to get one of these Hispanic workers to do a job they already know how to do than to train a white guy to do it. And that made perfect sense in terms of productive efficiency. But when labor union leaders found out about it, they were not the least bit happy. So it was that kind of tension between the necessities of wartime and sort of practical management at local level, and the broader policies that national labor unions and large railroads were trying to establish.
As you describe, the railroad business pretty much peaked during World War II with the incredible passenger loadings and the vast amounts of freight that were moved. From there, you tell a story of a gradual and sometimes not so gradual decline at the Pennsylvania Railroad. At the same time, though, you tell a story of bureaucratic infighting, which suggests that a lot of people were very concerned about protecting their own little part of the Pennsylvania Railroad and did not understand that the whole enterprise was in decline. For example, you have a very, for me at least, fascinating discussion of the argument, should we move to diesel engines or should we stick with coal? And apparently there were a whole lot of people at the Pennsylvania Railroad who didn't think that there should be a shift to diesel technology. Would you talk about how the company dealt with this decline and perhaps how its internal dynamics made it difficult for it to adapt?
Yeah, there were several. In fact, I can highlight three instances of that infighting. One was the one you mentioned, and that is you have to understand the context. The Pennsylvania Railroad's motive power department designed and built some of the best steam locomotives in the world. I mean, they were the experts. They were world leaders in this, and they were confronted with a revolutionary technological change, steam power to diesel power, and it's one that, to be fair, completely devalued their skill set. It rendered their skills of a lifetime irrelevant. And they frantically tried to develop high speed, high horsepower steam locomotives that were beyond the technological envelope of what could be accomplished. And they had really significant influence within the company. And it wasn't until a manager from essentially outside the system, he was actually the Western Region Vice President in Chicago, so about as far from Philadelphia as you can get. Jim Sims, who later became president of the railroad, he said, "Wait a minute, we got this all wrong. The motive power department is telling us how big these locomotives are, how much they can pull, how fast they can go. I don't care. What I care about is what does it cost to haul a train? And diesels can do that much more efficiently than steam locomotives. And I don't care that we've had a 100-year history of building steam locomotives. None of that matters." And he literally said, we have to uh, dieselize to save the company. He was quite right about that. If they hadn't done it, they would have gone bankrupt in the 50s, probably. So he prevailed, but it took several years to overcome that kind of uh, entrenched power of the motive power department. There's a second example, and that is this is also part of the decline of the railroad industry as trucks are taking over more and more of the freight business, especially what is known as less than carload lot traffic, that is small parcels and packages as opposed to like an entire car of coal. And the vice president in charge of traffic, Fred Carpy, said we have to address this by investing heavily in new box cars, faster trains, and so on for this less than carload lot service. And at the same time, Jim Newell, who's the vice president in charge of operations, says, no, that's totally the wrong thing to do. What we have to do is to invest in trailer on flat car and a piggyback service. And in the end, that turned out to be the more viable option. But at the time, each executive cited figures that said their view was right and the other view was wrong. And they developed what was really a visceral hatred for one another. They couldn't work together. Their relationship was so toxic, they destroyed each other's careers essentially over this. And no one could seem to kind of reconcile those two. And the final thing is to do with the 1968 Penn Central merger, when first Sims and later his successor as chairman of the board, Stuart Saunders, and others were pushing for this merger as something that had to be done. And David Bevan, the vice president in charge of finance, said this is a huge mistake. The purported savings are not going to materialize. What's in fact going to happen is the two companies involved, PRR and New York Central, are going to make massive investments in order to integrate their operations. And those investments are going to completely overwhelm any savings associated with more efficient operations and elimination of duplicate facilities. And he was right about that. But he also became a pariah within the company, and largely because of that, became the scapegoat for Penn Central's bankruptcy a few years after the merger.
So talk about the merger had been going on for a number of years. Finally, in the mid 60s, what's the momentum for this merger, given all the obvious costs that will be involved to bring it about? And did these people have a realistic sense of additional passengers, additional freight, greater savings? What was taking place there?
Well, this is in the context of this ongoing decline of the railroad industry, especially in the Northeast. And nobody knows what to do about it, right? No systematic transportation policy, no realistic possibility of either a government takeover of the railroad network or the kind of subsidies would be necessary to preserve the robust health of the railroad network. And so there is no solution here, really, except the last remaining possibility, and that is merger of parallel railroads, the elimination of duplicate facilities in order to achieve cost savings. And so that becomes the mantra. That's, what else can we do except this? And so there's a whole cascading series of mergers in the 1950s and in the late 50s and 1960s. And this presents a huge problem for the Interstate Commerce Commission. So 1920, they're ordered by Congress to prepare a consolidation program for the railroad industry. fails miserably. The Transportation Act of 1940 alleviates the ICC of that responsibility. So now in the 60s, the Interstate Commerce Commission concludes that not only are they not required to come up with a plan for railroad consolidation, they don't have any authority to engage in the planning of railroad consolidation. Instead, they have to treat each merger on a case-by-case basis, even though it's clear that all of these mergers are in some way interrelated. And so the ICC, at this critical moment in the history of the railroads, essentially goes AWOL from this entire process. And it's up to cabinet level agencies, especially Department of Justice, to get involved and to sort of balance out the issue of maintaining competition versus encouraging the economic survival of the railroads. And largely for political reasons, the DOJ shifts from the first perspective to the second, which is what allows the merger to go forward.
But around that same time, the federal government, Congress, were creating the Department of Transportation. Did leaders in that new department have anything to say about this pending merger?
Well, everybody had something to say about the pending merger. And so, yeah, DOJ was opposed on antitrust grounds. Department of Commerce was for it on the hope that it would preserve the railroads. Department of Labor was fine once railroads got concession. Department of Transportation then was arguing that none of those perspectives mattered because this was an issue of transportation policy, which is what was central to their mission. And so there was massive infighting. There was an interagency committee on transport mergers, which began really during the, I think, Eisenhower administration, actually. And it ceased to function because nobody was willing to kind of meaningfully make concessions on this. So not only was there sort of organizational paralysis within the ranks of Pennsylvania Railroad executives, within the highest ranks of government, all the agencies that should have been responsible for developing not just a national transportation policy, but a coherent policy on the balance between economic efficiency and economic equity. Nobody in the federal government was able to realistically and systematically address that issue.
Well, that
So,
provides a nice walk up to a final question here. Having studied the Pennsylvania Railroad in great detail, in your view, is there anything that management could have done to actually save this railroad and keep it as a functioning enterprise?
I'm always a little bit leery of counterfactual questions. I don't know what could have been. Um, if what we're talking about here is could I go back in time and pull out certain managers and replace them with other managers? I don't think the outcome would have been all that different. I mean, personalities do matter, especially Stuart Saunders, who was the big proponent of the Penn Central merger. Had it not been for him, would the merger taken place? Quite possible, yes. I mean, these are the interesting thing I think about the Pennsylvania railroad and the whole railroad industry in general is what we're confronting over and over again with, well, the kind of casual thing is companies are too big to fail or industries that are too big to fail. And that is how do we manage the sort of downstream effects of technological change, economic change, these sort of massive forces, whether it's highway competition, globalization, containerization, as you certainly know, had a profoundly disruptive effect on transportation patterns. Um, what exactly can we do to prevent companies from feeling the deleterious effects of that? And the answer, I think, is within the company, not much. And within the realm of public policy, there's a lot of debate on that. But we have to be careful to understand that, public policy is so inherently politicized, it may not be the best mechanism for picking winners and losers, or even for preserving enterprises that no longer function in the same way within the economic system as they used to. The issue, I think, for the railroads was how do we draw down the railroad industry, protect the livelihoods of people who work there, to ensure that they're not disadvantaged by forces that are completely beyond their control, and to maintain a robust national transportation system. And spoiler alert, I guess I'm now co-authoring a book on Conrail. And that was really what happened, and happened, I think, very effectively when the federal government became involved in the creation of Conrail in 1976 and in the decades that followed.
So can you tell us
Thank
about,
you. Oh,
I'm
so,
sorry, Paula, go ahead.
this has been a really great conversation. Al, thank you so much for coming into the book series. And Marc, thanks so much for these wonderful questions and hosting this interview. We'll be able to talk a little bit more after I sign off. And thank you everyone for watching.
Thanks to everybody. It was a fun morning. I enjoyed it.